Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for your patience. We just wanted to allow as many people to sign into the webinar as possible. Others will probably join us and they'll they'll land in wherever we're at just at this stage. So we'll get started with this evening's webinar. So thank you very much for joining us this evening and coming along to this Rush Control webinar. It's organised by the Source to Tap project and is supported by the College for Agriculture, Food and Rural Enterprise, or otherwise known as CAFRE, and also Teagasc as well. Yesterday, the Source to Tap project hosted an on-farm rush control event right on the banks of the River Derg at Achiarn near Caleta, just outside of Castlederg. And landowners from as far afield as Donegal Town and Coleraine came along to hear about different rush control techniques and how small changes to rush control practices can help protect river water quality, but that's also a source of raw drinking water, as well as benefiting the productivity and the profitability of their farm businesses at the same time. Tonight, we'll be virtually revisiting the same farm to hear all about the rush control methods. But before we do, we'll be joined by a host of experts who have joined me here on the screen this evening to kick off the proceedings. And they're going to help us to understand why rush control methods matter, both to water quality protection and to the success of the farm business. We'll hear from Diane Foster, who is the project manager of the Source to Tap project. Diane works with Northern Ireland Water, which is the lead partner on the project. And Diane, after she's spoken, will be followed by a short film that explains what the Source to Tap project is doing in the River Derg catchment, a river that straddles the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, and that is a source of shared drinking water for communities on both sides of the border. We'll then be joined by Rebecca Allen, also from Northern Ireland Water, Acting Water Catchment Manager, who will tell us about the effects of the rush control chemical MCPA on source drinking water. And then from AFBI, Rachel Cassidy, Catchment Scientist, will tell us a bit about MCPA's impact on the river environment. We'll then see a short film about different rush control methods, the things that we had demonstrated on the farm near Caleta. And this film has been produced in conjunction with CAFRE and with Teagasc, and we're delighted this evening to have Terence Henry with us from CAFRE and Donald Kennedy, who will join us from Teagasc to share their wealth of knowledge and expertise on rush control techniques. And then finally, all of the experts you hear from tonight, including Lorraine Gaston from Irish Water, Catchment Scientist, will join a discussion panel which you can pose your questions to and get more information about rush control techniques. We have a few polling questions that we're going to put up on the screen during the webinar, and we'd really like your participation in this. So when you see the questions appear on the screen, you'll have about 30 seconds to click one of the answers, and that will give us some information about you guys as attendees to the webinar and your thoughts on rush control. So before we get underway, just a few housekeeping rules for tonight's event. We're all, I think, still getting used to running these events virtually, even though we've been doing it for a while. And this is actually our first go at a webinar. So hopefully it runs smoothly for us, touch wood. The webinar is being recorded and it will be edited for use on the Source to Tap website afterwards. Now, as guests to the webinar, you can't be seen and your microphones are not enabled. So, as far as recording is concerned, no one should be worried that they would later be identified, and you'll all remain anonymous as far as the recording is concerned. At the bottom of your screens, there is a Q&A button, and this is where you can submit your questions as the evening goes on. So these questions will be collected for me to ask back to the panel during the question and answer session at the end of the webinar. And questions that come in along similar subjects or similar lines, we'll try and amalgamate together so that we can cover as many questions as possible. If we don't ask your question to the panel this evening, it's simply in the interests of time, and we will try and get answers back to you after the event in relation to your questions. So can I therefore ask that when you do write your question in the Q&A function on the webinar, you also include your first name, just so that we can identify who asked the question. At the bottom of your screen, there's also a chat button. and we would welcome any general comments that you have in the chat function, but please put your questions that you have in the Q&A function so that they're all together. And anyone that's hard of hearing, we've also enabled the subtitle function on the webinar, and you can turn this on by clicking a button with the letters CC on it. Now, a bit of a word of caution that this works by listening to the speakers on the webinar and auto-typing the subtitles. So it can be a little bit tested sometimes by regional accents. So we apologize in advance if the subtitles are not a word-for-word transcript of what's being said, but hopefully anybody that needs it, it will help you participate fully in the webinar. And finally, conscious that rural broadband speeds tend to vary dramatically across the island of Ireland, we've done our very best to reduce the file sizes of the films down so that it can be streamed by everyone. If, however, you do experience difficulty in viewing the films this evening during the webinar, a link to each of the films will be shared in the chat function. And if you click on this link, it will take you to our YouTube channel, where all the videos have already been uploaded and you can view them at reduced quality. So if you have a poorer broadband width, you should still be able to view those videos. But of course, if you go away to watch the link, please remember to come back again to continue to take part in the webinar. So without further ado, to warm you all up, I'd like to launch our first 2 polling questions before we go into our first presentation. So hopefully the question will appear on your screen now. So firstly, we wanted to ask you, are you a farmer or a landowner? So it's a simple yes or no answer to this question. Okay. And the second question should appear now. Hopefully. Okay. Do you farm in the River Derg catchment? Yes or no? Okay. So thank you for taking part in those first 2 questions. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Diane Foster, project manager of the Source to Tap project, who's going to introduce the project to us. So Diane, over to you.
Thanks very much, Mark. And thank you all very much for joining us tonight. This is the first time we've done a webinar, so I'd just like to extend my thanks to Mark and to Caitlin, who've been busy with us in the background and setting everything up. So without any further ado, I'll just give you a little bit of a background to the Source to Tap project, and just say a little bit about why we're involved in this sort of event tonight. So Source to Tap project is it's an innovative €4.9 million project, and it's focusing in on the Erne and Derg cross-border catchments, and it's all about trying to protect and improve our rivers and lakes in those catchments. So you can see in the little pictures there, the rivers and lakes, or the river in particular, in this particular instance. You can see the big water treatment works there, and then you can see the water that comes out of your tap. So that's the linkages there, and that's what we're all about. And particularly, we're all about MCPA and sediment. Sediment loss can give rise to colour and turbidity in the raw water that's taken out of the rivers and abstracted for treatment before it's then supplied to your taps. So that's our connection with all of this. Is we're all about trying to reduce the amount of MCPA and the amount of sediment loss into our rivers and lakes at source. And if we can do that, then it's a more sustainable option. So we're funded by the Interreg 5A programme, which is managed by SEUPB, which is a special EU programmes body. And we have match funding as well from the Department of Agricultural, Environment and Rural Affairs in Northern Ireland and the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage in Ireland. So we're a partnership project. We bring together experts from different organisations. So as Mark said, Northern Ireland Water is the lead partner, and we're joined in the partnership by Irish Water. And also then we have our experts on board from AFBI and from Ulster University, who are involved in the whole science and the monitoring on the project. We have the Rivers Trust, who've been involved in rolling out the Land Incentive Scheme, which you may hear mentioned later on today, and also in the whole community engagement element of the project. And we have East Border region who are involved in keeping us right in the whole funding and spend element of the project. So the aim of the project, we've kind of really alluded to already, I suppose. We're trying to explore sustainable, cost-effective measures to reduce pollution in our shared drinking water catchment. So we're trialling different pilots, and I'll talk a wee bit about them very briefly in a moment, but we're trialling different pilots to see what types of measures can improve water quality at source. So we're really talking about stopping things like the MCPA and the sediment getting into the rivers and lakes in the first place, so that when we take the water out for treatment, for drinking water supply, there's less of these different substances in it. So we're really trying to improve and secure safe drinking water sources. And by doing that also will help to improve what we call raw water quality. That's just the quality of the water in the rivers and lakes before anything happens to it. And we're hoping to improve that overall. And that's good for the environment. It's good for the fish and all the little insects that live in the river. It's good for all of us, the economy and everything. And it's also good for us, because as a company that supplies drinking water, it increases our costs, more challenging in treating the water if there's more things to take out of it. So if we can stop them getting into the river in the first place, it's a win-win for everybody. Now, I've just sort of going to conclude with just giving you a bit of a flavour of the other elements of the project. We're not just about the farming side of it. I'll come on to that in a wee minute, but we've other elements that we're covering as well in the project. So we've an element called Love Your Water, and this is all about citizen science. And some of you may already have been involved in this, because we've trained up Riverfly volunteers, and they're trained up in how to identify the little invertebrates that live in our rivers. And by doing that, we're hoping to empower and engage people in local communities in your areas to get out there and to keep an eye on their rivers, to monitor them every so often and to see what's living in them, and then to check against a database of what that quality for that river should be, so that they can help to detect where there are problems. Another element of the project is learning for water. And this is an element that we have developed our own education resources. They're online, so you can go onto the website and you can look at them. There's 5 different units, and our project officers go into schools, and they also will talk virtually online after COVID to schools and educate on, where our water comes from, how it gets polluted, how it's treated, all about the water cycle, that sort of thing. And we'll also engage with others through events like the Rush Control event yesterday, and indeed this webinar tonight. There's another couple of elements of the project, peatlands for water and forests for water, which are more related, I suppose, to the whole sediment loss side of things. In our peatlands for water work package, we've restored an area of peatland over at Tullycherry Forest in County Fermanagh, and that was planted in lodgepole pine previously, and we have restored it now back into peatland to try to restore the water table in that area. Another area, our Forests for Water pilot, we have trialled different measures to reduce sediment loss. We've worked with Forest Service Northern Ireland and also with Quilcha on that piece of work in their forests, implementing different measures and measuring and monitoring to work out the impacts of those measures, and do they help to further reduce the sediment loss after felling. And finally, the Farming for Water work package, which is the one that some of you may already be familiar with. Some of you may have participated in our pilot land incentive scheme. And that was, we've had nearly 120 farmers who have put measures in place on their farms. And we're very grateful for their involvement in our scheme. And they have been working hard by installing these measures to benefit both their farm business and also to reduce sediment and MCPA loss from their farms. So that's a flavour of the different work of the project. So I'm going to hand over again to Mark, and we're ready to watch the video. So just a wee thing I suppose to note is that the learning from all these different pilots will go into our legacy Source to Tap website. So keep an eye on the website, and as we produce the outputs, they'll all be loaded up there for others to learn from in the future. So I'll hand back to Mark. I'm happy to take any questions at the end. Thank you very much.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Diane, for that really good overview of the Source to Tap project and the breadth of the delivery of that project across the Erne and the Derg. So we're now going to watch a short film about the work that the Source to Tap project is delivering in the Derg River, and the link for this film has already been shared with you in the chat function, but hopefully you should be able to just view it here in the webinar.
The Derg River is formed by two main tributaries, the River Derg and the Mourne Beg River. The Mourne Beg River flows from Loch Mourne in County Donegal and winds its way through large areas of peat bog, which further downstream have been planted out in commercial forests. It merges with the River Derg approximately 2.5 kilometres above the town of Castlederg in County Tyrone. Meanwhile, the River Derg rises in Loch Derg in County Donegal, famed for its monastic island, and again flows east for approximately 12 kilometres before it merges with the Mourne Beg River to form the Derg River. The Derg River flows through the Lower Derg Valley, passing along the edge of the town of Castlederg before flowing into the River Strule just below the village of Ardstraw. The landscape of the Upper Derg catchment is dominated by large areas of open peat bog. Here, turf cutting can degrade the peaty soils and cause many tiny particles to run off the land into the river, colouring the water. The Killader Forest is one of the largest areas of coniferous forest in Ireland. Forestry is the main land use for the upper sections of the Derg and Mourne Beg rivers. Timber harvesting on such fragile peaty soils risks the soil from freshly harvested areas being washed off into nearby watercourses. This wet land, with its plentiful supply of rain, gives rise to the growth of rushes, which presents a challenge to farmers trying to meet agricultural land management requirements. In recent years, the quantities of a herbicide called MCPA used to kill rushes and docks has been increasing in our rivers and lakes. Unrestricted livestock access to our rivers and lochs and the over-application of slurry and fertiliser in the soils can all increase the risk of soil and nutrients lost to watercourses. The Derg River is a precious source of drinking water for people who live in the area. Before it can come out of your tap, the water is treated to a high standard to remove the contaminants washed into the rivers and lochs. The flashy nature of the Derg River means that when it rains, the water runs quickly off the land, carrying contaminants with it. Sediment, herbicides, colour and all other impurities must be removed by Irish Water and Northern Ireland Water in order for our drinking water to meet stringent water quality targets. The more contaminants there are in the water, the more challenging and costly that water treatment process can be, and multi-million scale investment is often needed to ensure pesticides are all removed. In Derg water treatment works between Castlederg and Ardstraw, the water is screened to remove debris before entering two large mixer tanks where it is dosed with lime to change the acidity of the water and aluminium sulfate to enhance the coagulation process. Air filtration systems create millions of tiny bubbles which stick to particles of soil and peat and cause it to rise to the surface, where it decants off to sludge holding tanks. The water must then be passed through large tanks filled with tiny pieces of carbon, which filter the water to improve the taste and odour and remove the herbicides. If there are high quantities of herbicides such as MCPA in the water, it means that the carbon becomes quickly saturated with the MCPA and needs to be taken off site more often to be replenished. This increases the costs of water treatment. Finally, the water is tested again to check the quality before it is of a suitably high standard to be piped out to our homes and families. The Source to Tap project is a €4.9 million EU Interreg 5A funded project which aims to contribute to improvements in water quality in the Erne and Derg cross-border river catchments that are a source of our drinking water. It is piloting changes in land management techniques such as fencing of rivers to exclude livestock and replacing boom spraying of MCPA with weed wipers to apply herbicide for rush control, which helps to reduce the amount of herbicide running off into our rivers and streams. The project is also working with local communities to raise awareness about where our drinking water comes from, carrying out school visits and community events. Volunteers in the Derg are being trained in the riverfly monitoring technique and equipped to monitor the quality of their local rivers. By checking the tiny riverfly creatures called invertebrates that live in the bottom of our rivers, we can tell how clean the water is. Our drinking water is precious, and we can all make a difference in protecting it.
Okay, everyone, hopefully you enjoyed that short film, which sets out what the Source to Tap project is aiming to achieve in the Derg and the Erne catchments. Now, before we introduce our next speaker, we have 2 more polling questions for you, which will appear on the screen now. So the first of these questions is, do you currently use weed wiping to control rushes? Yes or no? And secondly, do you use MCPA to control rushes? So this would be boom spraying using MCPA. Okay, thank you very much. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Rebecca Allen, who is our next speaker. Rebecca works for Northern Ireland Water as the acting water catchment manager. And she's going to explain to us the effects of MCPA on source drinking water.
Thanks very much, Mark. Hold on a wee second. Okay. So thank you, Mark. So I'm Rebecca and I'm acting catchment manager at NI Water at the moment. And I'm going to speak today just briefly about MCPA as a current challenge for us in the water industry in producing clean and safe drinking water. How the water is treated, I'm going to go over that, and just where we all sit in the process and what we can do.
Rebecca,
Yeah.
It's Mark here. Can you change your display settings at the top of your screen
Sure.
because you're currently sharing your presenter view?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, okay, no problem.
Share that. So, okay.
That's perfect, Rebecca. You're good to go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Is that okay still, Mark? Yeah.
That's it. That's perfect, Rebecca. Go on ahead.
Okay. So, so just as a bit of a case study, I'm going to go over the challenges that we have with the water treatment process at the Derg Water Treatment Works. So, as the little video and as Diane mentioned, the Derg treatment works, it abstracts water from the Derg and Struil rivers. It serves a population, the populations around Castlederg, Strabane and Omagh on the Northern Ireland side. It's about 7 kilometres outside Castlederg. It's quite a large cross-border catchment, 369 kilometres squared, 66% of which is in Northern Ireland and 34% of which is in Ireland. The maximum capacity per day, so that's the maximum amount of water which can be created at the treatment works, is about 26 million litres of water per day. So on average, it's a bit less than that, but it's quite high, a high amount. It's a big treatment works. So amongst our main challenges really at the treatment works there is, as Dan said, the removal of the commonly used grassland herbicide MCPA. So what is MCPA? I'm not a scientist, I'll leave that to Rachel, but just to go over quickly what it means to us in the water industry. It's a systemic hormone type herbicide, which really means, all it means is it acts inside the plant. The plant absorbs it and it sort of mimics a hormone inside the plant, and that's how it controls and kills the rushes. The target weed is rushes, as Diane said before. It's used for other broadleaf control as well, as most of you might know that you use if you use it. It's very soluble, so it gets into the water easily and it stays there, hangs about in the water environment for up to 6 weeks. So that's what we call a long half-life. It takes quite a while to break down, unlike other chemicals and pesticides. And then it's highly potent. You know, you use these chemicals and you realize they're strong, but really when you think about a spillage of 1 gram of this stuff in a river, it can be found up to 30 kilometers downstream above the drinking water limit. It's so strong. So it takes about 1 gram would need to be diluted by about 10 megaliters, 10 million liters of water to be not detected anymore. That's how strong it is. So why is it an issue for us? Well, it's difficult and expensive to remove, and really because we have to keep removing it from the treatment works using chemicals and using filter processes, it's not really sustainable for us in a way, and it's maybe not sustainable for to be used as a chemical either, because if it keeps getting found in the water, there's a potential down the line that it could, you know, it could be taken off the market, for example, although don't take my word for that. So really, if you look at this wee graph, don't be worried too much about the dates, but it appears at our treatment works on a seasonal, you can see that a seasonal sort of a pattern there, and it sort of goes along with the way people use it. So in a sort of March in through till October, and then nothing through the winter. It goes with the weed season, the rush season. So you can see there, our challenge is this graph shows the typical sort of MCPA levels in the raw water coming into the treatment works before it's treated. And the challenge for us is that we have to get the blue lines below the red line. So for those big spikes there that happen, we have to treat that water and remove all that MCPA down to below that red line. So it's a crazy challenge for us, and it's quite a significant challenge for us to do that in the treatment works. So I'm just going to go, the video alluded to it, but I'm just going to go into the process now, the typical treatment process. There's quite a lot of chemicals used in the treatment process at DERG, and it might seem a bit scary and a bit overwhelming, but it actually, it's all used for to remove things, to optimize different treatment processes. So the water is pumped in from the Derg or Struil rivers in a blend, depending on what time of year it is. And then it goes through band screens to remove any debris like leaves or whatever. Aluminium sulfate, or alum as they call it, is added as a clarifier, and lime is added to correct the pH so that alum works well. So lime's added because the water coming into Derg is slightly acidic. So then the alum causes material in the water, like the bits of carbon and the smaller parts of carbon that are dissolved, to sort of form together into a flock, which are skimmed off or floated up to the surface and skimmed off using dissolved air flotation cells. So lime slurry is added then at that point to prior to primary filters to raise the pH again and facilitate soluble aluminium removal on primary filters. So there's aluminium and the likes of other things like manganese that are in your water naturally coming out of the river. So then it goes through 5 rapid gravity filters. So each filter media consists of anthracite, sand, and sometimes bits of gravel. So it's like a sort of like a sand filter. Then onto the bit in the middle with the red box around there, it's the magic GAC filters. So they're granular activated carbon filters, and they remove things like pesticides and forms of carbon which cause issues downstream and can cause taste and odor issues. Sorry. After that, then hypochlorite's added, chlorine really, in other words, for disinfection, and the manganese filters naturally take out, which naturally occurs in the water, removes the manganese. And manganese is a heavy metal. It's not very good for you, but it also turns your clothes black in the washing machine. So that's why we take that out. Then more chlorine's added for residual disinfection down into the network, so that the water's safe right down to the bottom end of, miles away down the line. And then orthophosphoric acid's added, and it's added to coat any lead pipes that might still be left in the network, so that there's no lead leaching into any water anywhere. And then a couple more things are added, and the water's going into the surface reservoirs, which are the sort of buried concrete reservoirs under the ground, and then into your tap. The sludge cake, which is the stuff that gets skimmed off after the air flotation, it gets thickened and made into cake or bricks, and then disposed of to landfill, or I think it gets tankered off to England in some places. So in terms of what a granular activated carbon plant is, when we think about MCPA, this is where the MCPA is removed, but it's not just a wee filter. The stuff inside the activated carbon filter is quite like a Brita filter that you might have seen or you might use in your house. But this granular activated carbon plant is a huge building. So this is the building at Derg. It's quite new, it's only a few years old. And it houses 6 of these filters. It's cost £5 million to build. So, so the GAC, the carbon it's a high surface area. It's tiny grains of carbon. It's high surface area, so it absorbs contaminants, and it's activated by high temperature. So as the video said, whenever it gets saturated with stuff, it has to be sent off to be regenerated in a high temperature furnace. So the way it works is molecular compounds are kinetically attracted to the porous surface of the carbon. So once it's activated by heat, it just absorbs everything in terms of organic things and things that cause taste and odor issues and pesticides. So it's mostly made from anthracite, but it can be made from coal and lignite and stuff as well. So that wasn't just a £5 million spend one-off at treatment works. Those filters have to be regenerated every few months, can be sometimes less than that. And they take about £20,000 a go. So so they're quite expensive. So what can we do? Well, really, I always like to say, think about your water. And I'm not just talking about to the agricultural people on this call, but we all really need to think about our water, because anything that we do on our land, in our garden, in the field, in the yard, in the garage, it all can come around and have an effect on drinking water catchment. So just have a think and remember that everything that happens in your catchment can come back and has to go through the treatment process. So and just remember again how strong the stuff is. I know you know how strong it is because you're watering it down to the right application rates, but it's seriously potent. And then always remember to follow the best practice guidelines and the label instructions. And sometimes, as you know, the labels, you have to peel the labels back on the container to see the application rates. Sometimes it's a bit difficult to do that, and it's not very obvious. So just remember that, because 40% of the pesticides that run off into the rivers apparently can come from the yard, just from drain washings and rinsings, things like that. So if the last thing is then, if you're able to get out and try out alternative weed control methods like the weed wiping, please do, because it helps us out. It helps us reduce the levels of MCPA coming into the treatment works potentially. And a weed wiper doesn't need to be expensive as well. That's the last thing I'll just add on. This little thing here is a Quad-X, but it's one of the more affordable ones, let's say, so you don't have to really splash out. So I just would like you to stop and think, or everybody just stop and think about the water we drink because all our actions really can affect water quality. So thanks very much. That's me. I'm happy to take questions at the end.
Okay, Rebecca, thank you so much for that. I would challenge anyone that's not directly involved in the water industry to not be gobsmacked at the processes that water goes through to ensure that it's absolutely clean and wholesome when it reaches our taps. So thank you very much for that. We're now going to hear from Rachel Cassidy. Rachel is a catchment scientist from the Agri-Food and Biosciences Institute and has been working on the Source to Tap project, amongst other projects in Northern Ireland as well, looking at how land management practices can positively and sometimes negatively impact on the water environment. So Rachel, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Hello. Right, I'm going to see if I can share this without making a mess of it.
No, we can hear you, and now we can see your screen. That's great. Thank you.
Good. Okay. Right. Well, I suppose I work in AFBI and really do research on everything that can contaminate water and rivers in Northern Ireland. And this evening, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of what we found out about MCPA in the river environment over the last 3-4 years of the Source to Tap project. It's just a quick look, really, but it has really improved our knowledge and understanding of how MCPA works and get on from land into water. Back in 2017, 2018, there were many unknowns. We knew from Northern Ireland Water and from Irish Water that MCPA was an issue in drinking water, but a lot of the processes were unclear. We didn't know how, where or when it was entering the system, whether it was spills, whether it was spray drift, whether it hung about on land or in water for long periods of time, and when it came through. And part of that was down to the limitations in monitoring data. MCPA analysis as an acid herbicide is really expensive to start with, and then it requires specialist laboratories to analyse it. And so to try and meet this data need, in 2018, the Source to Tap project established, first of all, a spatial sampling campaign where we went across the Derg catchment, you can see in the bottom right, and sampled at different locations to try and find out where the hotspots were for MCPA coming into the system relative to land use. We also then, at the outlet where the star is, right beside the abstraction point, put in a kiosk and an auto sampler and started taking samples every 7 hours during the peak season for MCPA, and then when it quieted down, daily in winter. So that information gave us a real insight into the processes and movement and timing of MCPA loss within the river system before it gets to the treatment works where all the magic that Becca outlined happens. So MCPA, there's a lot applied, so I suppose there's a lot to lose. According to the pesticide surveys for Northern Ireland that happen every 4 years, MCPA is #1 in the top 10 of active ingredients applied to grassland and fodder by quantity. So it's almost more than everything else added up at 45,000 kilos per year. And that, if we turn that into drums of MCPA, is equivalent to 3,600 drums of your standard MCPA salt. So that's a lot that has the potential to be lost. And the primary use, as we've said, is rushes, but it is applied on everything from rusk grazing to premium silage grassland for rush and broadleafed weed control, so docks and thistles and dandelions and everything like that, without really damaging the grass. As Becca said, MCPA's main problem is that it doesn't stick well to anything. Normally, herbicides might bind quite well to soil, MCPA doesn't. So as soon as it hits water, a fraction of its lost really easily and moves quickly. And that solubility, you know, even small losses are an issue when you think of the regulatory limits for treated drinking water are tiny at 0.1 micrograms per litre, and a microgram per litre is a millionth of a gram. So it takes very little to exceed those limits that were mentioned earlier. So I suppose, as well as there being a plentiful potential source of MCPA, we are blessed in the northwest with some fairly high rainfall, and you know, over 2.5 meters of rain a year within the Derg catchment in the west, comparing to 600 or 700 millimeters out and around Strangford. So as well as having probably quite a lot of rushes, there's a lot of rainfall, and that helps mobilize and generate runoff on soil, taking with it not just any pesticides, but it'll take phosphorus and sediment into drains that go into streams, into the river, and then move on downstream to where the abstraction points are. So we really are facing a challenge in terms of trying to mitigate that. You've got high rainfall, dynamic system, so a lot of energy to move stuff, and that all poses a challenge for water treatment. So I suppose the first thing I'll go through is where we looked within the catchment and where our hot areas were. So we sampled down the catchment, as you can see, from Loch Mourne up at Barnes and Loch Derg, down through this middle zone where you move from peatland into rough grazing and better grazing, and then down around Castle Derg where it's quite intensively farmed. And that's the pale green areas on this map are where is all areas of improved grassland. And as we moved down the system, we found that the concentrations of MCPA sharply went up once you passed about this line beyond D3 and D4 into the catchment. So areas where more improved grassland are where we get the highest concentrations, and they're the focus for the land incentives associated with MCPA. So I suppose I'm going to show you some data now. And as Diane knows, I love data, but sometimes I can show people too much and it frightens them, but I will try. So this graph, first of all, is showing a year of our high resolution monitoring data, or it will be in a minute. So it going from the 1st of April 2020 to the 1st of April 2021. So the blue line is the river flow. So you can see it was dry back in April 2020 through to the end of June. And then it made up for it with a lot of rainfall events. And you can see how flashy the catchment is. It goes from 3 or 4 cubic meters per second up to 180 within a short period of time, and then falls down rapidly. So on top of that, that red line going across is that target that the water treatment works has to hit to ensure the treated water is potable. And we use that just as a reference to show how far away from it the raw water in the river is. So the pink dots are the concentrations of MCPA every week if we were down and took a single sample in a bottle and brought it back without our high resolution gear. And you can see, as Becca said, there is that summer period where 8 of the samples in the year are above the limit. So there's a sign there's something wrong there, but there's not enough evidence when you're just sampling at a weekly basis. So now I'm going to superimpose on that our 7-hourly data, and that's these green dots. So in that, I hope you can see that there's quite a difference in terms of the amount of information you're getting. We're capturing all these very sharp peaks in concentration that don't last very long, but that are very high relative to the red line. And they're mainly concentrated in that peak season between May and October. And then if you look later in the year, the peaks exceedances disappear, but you can still see there's always green data on the graph. And that means that of the 3,600 samples we've taken from the Derg catchment, we have never not measured MCPA. So it's persistent on a fairly permanent basis as far as we can see, right through winter when no spraying's going on. So that was surprising, and it's something we need to look into further. And so I'm just going to zoom in to show you for a few months of data. This is from June through to the end of July, what it looks like. So you see the peaks in blue, that's the rainfall events coming through and causing a flood in the river. The green dots are our 7-hourly samples. And you can see that for every increase in flow, there's quite a sharp peak in concentration that lasts a bit longer. And it doesn't really seem to matter the size of the event. You can have a very small event and MCPA available and it'll flush in. So what this is telling us is that most of the MCPA coming into the river is washing off the surface, coming with the water into the river and being part of the flood, and then fading away afterwards as the flood recedes. And that accounts for about 77% of what's lost in the catchment. However, you also see these events where there's a peak in MCPA here and another here perhaps, where the flow is going down low, so that there's no rain associated with that, but it's probably, we think, maybe associated with disposal issues or a leak somewhere in the catchment where it's been spilled, that slowly works its way through drains into the river and then comes through at the outlet. So we see through this sampling, both the majority of events are coming through quickly with rainfall, that's in storm events, but we also see these events that are not associated with rainfall that are probably due to a leak or a spill somewhere, although they are scarcer now than when we first looked back in 2018. So what are we seeing in terms of changes since monitoring began? Well, we've been using the concentrations and the flow in the river to work out loads over time, and flow weighted concentrations. I'll not talk too much about them, but loads, this is the kilos of MCPA coming down the river each year. And this is just though for the May to August period so that I can compare the 4 years so far. So in May to August 2018, 30 kilos, May to August 2019, 67 kilos, May to August 2020, 47, and this year 14. So there has been quite a big drop in the load in 2021. And we think that is the impact of good farmer practice and the land incentive scheme work that's been going on there. And you can see as well this flow weighted concentration that's kind of balanced out so that you can compare in time regardless of what the weather conditions are. And we've seen since 2019 a steady decrease in that concentration, again indicating that the land incentive scheme and your efforts are having impact. So I suppose to summarize, the insights that we've got from being able to do 7-hourly monitoring for this period of time through the land incentive scheme has shown us both the prevalence and the persistence of MCPA in the Derg catchment. We're able now to highlight that most of the losses are occurring during storm events. This is something that the water companies can maybe use to get water for other sources at times or dilute to try and take the pressure off the carbon filters. The fact that we're seeing MCPA always in the catchment is indicating that it's sitting somewhere and not degrading as quickly as it's been suggested in the literature. Anaerobic conditions are really good for that. So we think it's probably sitting in the peaty, wet soils over a period and then slowly leaching out through winter. There are some peaks, as I said, not linked to rainfall. This is around handling and disposal, but they are less frequent than they used to be. So practices are improving and the land incentive scheme overall seems to be having an effect. So the collective efforts of everyone in the catchment is making a difference. So I'll leave it there, and if there's any questions you can ask afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. That, as always, is a fascinating insight into how what we do on the land can affect a river. And I always think it's quite surprising when you see the spikes of MCPA, even as you say, when there's no rainfall event associated with it. I think probably one of the big take homes from that as well is that just one drop of MCPA, literally one drop, can raise the level of MCPA above that red line of 0.1 micrograms per litre. above that standard for 30 kilometers in a river. So just one drop can have an effect over such a large area. And the reduction in MCPA that we're seeing in the Derg now is very much associated with farmers switching from using MCPA with boom sprayers to using weed wiping as an alternative. So we're going to see a short film now about the different techniques that farmers can use to control rushes and how this would benefit both the farm environment and the river. Before it starts playing, can I just remind you all that if you have any questions you want to ask, you can be adding them to the Q&A section at the bottom of the page, and you can add those as we go along, and then we'll be able to put those to the panel at the end. So thank you very much.
Rushy fields are a familiar sight across farmland on the island of Ireland. Our wet climate and our poorly draining soils are the perfect breeding ground for soft rush. But these plants present constant challenges for our farmers, and sometimes the methods used have unintended impacts on our rivers and lakes. Choosing how and when to treat rushes can affect how successful the control methods are and what impact they have on our watery environment. So let's find out a little more about different types of rush control and how we can protect our rivers. So Terence, can you tell us about soft rush? What is it and how does it grow?
Well, soft rush is not unique to this country. In fact, it's found in most countries throughout the world, and it is associated mostly with wet or waterlogged soils or poorly drained soils, and also soils of low fertility and high acidity. So this is a soft rush plant that we've dug up earlier, and you can see the underground rhizome system, which sends up these stems. They're not leaves, they're stems, and the stems can reach about a metre and a half in height. And near the top of the stem we can see the seed head here, the brown seed head. Now it's been estimated that over the lifetime of one of the rush plants, an individual plant can produce up to 700,000 seeds. And these seeds can survive in the soil, can lie dormant in the soil for up to 60 years.
So why do rushes have to be controlled by farmers in the first place?
Well, there are two reasons why rushes need to be controlled. Number one, they are of low palatability and very poor digestibility by livestock. So they're much less useful nutritionally to stock than, say, grass or clover. And the second reason is that areas covered by dense or impenetrable rush are ineligible for payment under land-based schemes.
So about 6 weeks ago you came to this very rushy field and you prepared some plots to compare different rush control methods. Tell us what you did and what you found.
Well, after trialling various methods over some years, we've focused really on two rush control strategies in this field. One plot we cut for the last 2 years. In other words, we topped it in 2020 and then it was topped again in 2021. And the second plot we topped in 2020 and then we weed wiped with glyphosate about 6 weeks ago.
You mentioned weed wiping. Can you talk us through the weed wiping process?
Well, weed wiping is just a bit like applying paint using a roller. Only those plants which are touched by the glyphosate in this case will actually be killed by it. And a very important point to make here if you're going to do weed wiping is to graze between the rush plants as tightly as you can beforehand. And then you come along with the weed wiper, which is raised a little bit above ground level, and the weed wiper will only hit the rush, which is the stock won't eat, and is standing taller than the other plants. Glyphosate is the herbicide that's used in weed wipers. It's important to note that MCPA is not licensed for use in weed wipers.
Is there a particular season for weed wiping?
Well, as glyphosate, the herbicide we're talking about, is taken up into the leaves and then translocated right through the plant, it's best carried out in the summer months. But it is important to note that that treatment should be delayed until after the 15th of July, where there's breeding waders using the site to allow the fledglings to escape. And also I should point out that in some of the agri-environment schemes, for example in the environmental farming scheme, chemical control is not allowed on any breeding wader site. Rushes there have to be controlled by cutting only. It's important to note that either a licensed contractor or a trained operator should be used in the application of glyphosate using a weed wiper. And also it is preferable to use a quad, since these rushes are on wet sites. Heavy agricultural machinery is going to track the soil and open up spaces and allow the seeds to germinate.
So here we are, Terence, you know, at the weed wiped field 6 weeks on, and you can see the difference already. What benefits would you say weed wiping has compared to other methods?
Well, the weed wiping with glyphosate has been the most effective on this particular site. And as you look across, you can see about 80% of the rushes have been killed here, which we're very, very pleased with. The other important point to make is that weed wiping with the herbicide glyphosate is much preferable to using MCPA, because MCPA persists far longer in the environment, particularly in the water environment, than does glyphosate. MCPA can persist for up to 3 to 4 weeks, whereas glyphosate is broken down in 3 to 7 days. Another benefit of using glyphosate applied using a weed wiper is that far less of the chemical is used compared to if you were using a boom sprayer. In fact, I've researched that about 1/8 of the total volume of herbicide is used compared to using a boom sprayer.
So Donal, I understand that a lot of farmers use herbicides like MCPA to control the rushes, but why is it so important that we encourage them to use weed wiping instead?
Yes, we encourage them to use weed wiping because it's a more effective method of controlling rushes and killing them. MCPA, as you know, is a very unstable product, and one drop of it can affect 30 kilometres distance of water course. The boom sprayer can affect the hedgerows around, and also with the drift getting into the water course. The weed wiper with the glyphosate is a more targeted and, as I said, an effective approach for killing rushes.
So here we are at the plot where the rushes have been topped. Can you tell us how effective topping is compared to other methods?
Topping is a very effective method of controlling rushes in pasture, but to control them by topping only, you would have to top at least 6 times a year, and this is not feasible from a financial point of view. It is more effective to top and then come in with your weed wiper and chemical to control the rushes.
Are there other ways of dealing with rushes without using herbicides, and which methods would you say would be the most effective?
Yes, there is other methods for treating and controlling rushes in pasture land. First of all, I'd look at what's causing the rush growth, and basically that's rushes favour wet soils. So we have to look at the drainage system that needs to be put in place to reduce the water table. Topping and mulching is another method of controlling rushes on pasture land. I'd also look at, which I think is very important, is soil sampling and soil testing your ground to know the current status of the soil itself. And we always target for good grassland management a pH of 6 or above it, and that will not favour rush growth. These methods will help reduce the rush population and be very cost effective to the farmer.
And any advice on how to increase the pH?
Yes, what you do is you apply lime to the soil. Now in this type of ground here, I wouldn't be applying more than 2.5 tonne to the hectare, to the acre at a time.
And how does the farm business benefit from these changes to land management practice?
Well, as I said, you get a better pasture production with the reduction of rust infestation and grassland. You get a better performance from the animals through better grazing management and tighter grazing by the animals. You get an improved water quality through less nutrients getting into the water and chemicals from the boom sprayer versus the weed wiper. You also get a reduction in soil compaction with less machinery coming in on the ground.
So there you have it. Rush control is a necessary land management practice, but by making small changes to how it's done can save time, money, and help the environment. These changes can also protect your drinking water supplies, as well as making sure that your farm is productive.
Okay, so hopefully everyone was able to stream the video okay and see it properly. And we're delighted this evening to have Terence Henry and Donal Kennedy with us, who both featured in that film. And what we're going to do now is invite the panel to all come onto the screen. And we're going to put questions to the panel. Now, see, we have one question in the Q&A section. If you do have any questions now that you would like to ask, if you could type them into the Q&A function, we can certainly put those to the panel. But I suppose taking chairperson's prerogative, I might ask a question just to kick off. And I suppose it's born out of a bit of ignorance. So I'm not a farmer. I have to declare that straight away. So you see, when you do weed wiping and the rushes get killed off, do they have to, do the dead rushes have to be cut and topped afterwards, or do you just leave the rushes in the field then? What happens to them? I think you can unmute yourselves now as panelists if you want to answer the question. Terence, do you want to?
Your question was basically about whether after you do the weed wiping with glyphosate, if you need to top the rushes. It'd be very important not to go in and top them very early on, because glyphosate is a translocated herbicide. So if it's taken up through the stems of the rush plant, it takes time for it to get translocated down, right down into, remember I talked about the rhizome system, which then will lead to the roots. So it takes a period of time. Now that varies with the ambient temperature. So if you top too early, you actually don't allow sufficient time for that translocation of the systemic herbicide right down into the rhizomes. Right. So that's very important. But really, from what we saw in the video there, that those rush tussocks were pretty much dead in most cases. So it probably would be okay to top them now, but there's really no need because they will, like every biological matter, they will decay into the soil, you know, and maybe add to the humus. So the humus content, the organic content of those rush soils will be very, very high anyway. So there's very little need to add more organic matter, but they will, the rush stems will decay away over time. Unless Donal wants to add something.
No, I'm in total agreement with Terence there. There's no reason for you to go in and top them. They will decay, and the fact that the glyphosate is going down into the root or the stones, as the rhizomes, as Terence said, it's killing the plant. The plant is dead. You've achieved your aim.
Yeah. So yeah, it's really important. It's something I've learned then, you know, that even when you've weed wiped and probably a few weeks later the rushes start to turn brown, they maybe look dead on the surface, but you need to leave them some time is what you're saying to let that chemical get down into the rhizome system and really kill the plant off. And then if I understand you rightly, you don't have to top them at all. Those dead rushes will all just break down in the field. So that's really good to know. Someone else is... Sorry,
Mark, it's supposed to really understand the MCPA won't go down into the rhizomes, whereas the glyphosate will do that for you.
Right. Okay. So they're working slightly differently. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
You see, sorry, Mark, just to come in there. In terms of timing, I don't know whether that was covered in the video. In terms of timing of the application of glyphosate, it'll obviously work best whenever the plants are actively growing. So if you say in the video there, we saw that the rush is cut back after the 15th of July, and then it will send up new shoots, hopefully in the next month or so. Say by about 15th of July, 15th of August, 20th of August, come in with the weed wiper after you've done their grazing. Okay. Now the shoots will still be quite active at that stage, so the glyphosate will be taken up much better than say you do it later on in the year, say at this time of the year. Okay.
Okay. Someone has asked here, does weed wiping need to be done annually?
Like everything else, Mark, it depends. I mean, if it's a low cover of rushes, one weed wipe might do the job. But in most cases, remember I said in the video that seeds can remain viable in the soil for up to 60 years. So it is. So even you kill existing rush in the grassland, those seeds might well germinate over the coming years. I'm not saying you'd have to keep at it for 60 years, but you might need some treatment for a few years or every other year afterwards. It very much depends on the individual situation. I mean, none of these things, are clear cut, and I should say that rush control is not just simply about using weed wiping with glyphosate. There's a whole lot of things need to be taken in, as Donald said in his interview, acidity of the soil, fertility of the soil, drainage. If you get heavy poaching of the ground in the winter or say late autumn time, then you create bare ground conditions for the rush seeds to germinate. So one approach is not likely to be sufficient in itself. You need a combination of 2, 3, maybe all 5 of those things that I listed there to get effective control of rush. So it very much depends on the situation. But in answer to that question, maybe you will have to come in for a few years or every other year and complete and continue with the weed wiping. But it'll take less chemical, you see, in year 2 and year 3 and so forth, because there will be a lower percentage cover of rush.
Yeah. Okay. No, that makes perfect sense.
I suppose to agree with Terence there, Mark. It depends on the level of infestation and depends on the control you want. But like as Terence said, it's a combined approach that you're looking at. What you're trying to control, and that I'd get the same question put to me in relation to dot control. You need to spray every year. Again, it depends on the level of infestation and the cost versus what infestation is there.
Yeah. Okay. So another interesting question that's coming now is comparing kind of the methods of boom spraying MCPA with weed wiping. And the specific question is, with boom spraying of MCPA, you need to leave a 5-meter buffer between a watercourse and where you're spraying, or maybe between a hedge and where you're spraying. Do you need to leave the same buffer if you're weed wiping?
I would say for best practice, yes. I would leave that from a water quality point of view. You're using a different product. You're using glyphosate versus the MCPA. But from safe practice, yes, you could go within a metre, metre and a half of the water course.
Yeah, so you haven't obviously got that drift that occurs with boom spraying when you're weed wiping, so you remove that risk of chemical getting to the water course. But because you're still applying a chemical through weed wiping, in this case glyphosate, what you're saying then is that leaving a buffer still helps protect the water course from anything that might wash across the surface, albeit that the risk of that's relatively low, but still can happen, obviously. So yeah, okay.
Yeah, exactly. Best practice I would adhere to.
Okay. So a really good question here now, and it links back to, I suppose, why farmers are having to control rushes in the first place. Does the panel think that farmers should be allowed to have more rushes in their fields before their basic payments would be affected? You know, which if was the case, less MCPA would be used or less chemical would be used overall. And actually, there might be other benefits to allowing the rushes to grow in the fields. You know, it's suggested in the question here, maybe they could help reduce flooding in some way. Or I'm thinking off the top of my head, even some nesting birds, for example, on the ground, you know, benefit from rushes. So why is it that farmers maybe can't let rushes grow a bit more in their fields without risk of losing area-based payments?
Those, the area-based payments, Mark, are paid for land that is in agricultural use, put it simply like that. If a field is covered by dense, impenetrable rush, it's difficult to walk through. Obviously, there's hardly any grazing there, so that field will not be eligible for the basic payment scheme or the environmental farming scheme. Having said that, it is important to note that fields that are rush that is well managed in fields, for example, it's cut on a regular basis, and the sort of green, you know, the fresh green shoots that we saw there in the video, those fields are completely eligible for basic payment scheme and the environmental farming scheme. So it's not a simple binary thing, should we have rush or should we not rush? In fact, you mentioned there about rush maybe being good for nesting birds. That's true up to a limit as well. I mean, the RSPB, they often refer to anything more than 30% rush cover in a field is too much for breeding waders. You know, lapwing, for example, they like fields that are pretty open, you know, with tightly grazed swards, with a limited amount of rush, you know, just some tussocks here and there that will provide cover for their nests and for their fledglings. Whereas snipe will tolerate a bit more rush. You know, they like a bit more cover. But once you get too much cover, you don't have so much snipe either. And the other thing about rush, too much rush is a very, very competitive species. In fact, it outcompete grass, clover, and all those other herbs. So if you have a heavy infestation of rush, you have very, very limited biodiversity in that field. So all the wee plants that grow in at the bottom will never see the light, quite frankly, and will never, you know, won't continue to persist in a heavily infested rush sward. So it's not just as simple, should farmers be allowed to grow more rush, you know, to meet the basic payment scheme or whatever. I mean, heavy rush is not good for agriculture. It's not good for biodiversity. You know, and therefore those fields are ineligible. Does anybody else want to add anything to that?
Can I add something, Terence, just to the second, about the second half of that great question, where it mentions rushes and flood mitigation. I'm not a scientist, so I'll just say, in my experience with rushes, the rushes seem to keep the ground wetter in the way they grow together, especially dense rush, and they create that big mat of rhizomes. What, you know, do you think that the rushes, that person asked that question there, do you think the rushes keep the ground wet, or do you think the rushes take the water out? I'm just interested. It's a very good question. Do you know, I always really see rushes keeping the water in the soil, but I'm not so sure now.
Well, they do, Rebecca, store water in the rhizome system at the bottom of the plant there, and that's why rushes will do, you know, well in dry periods, because of this store of water, which the grass roots and all will not be able to compete with them. So rushes will store the water in the rhizome system. So come a dry spell, the rushes seem to do even better because they have plenty of heat and they have plenty of water. So I hope does that answer? Yeah.
I suppose to follow in on that, Rebecca, you're answering it in terms, if you think about nutrient loss to the water courses is one of the significant problems, and the rush overland flow, we say in Cavan and Monaghan, phosphorus is the biggest problem, and phosphorus ends up in the water. 7% of the phosphorus ends up in the water through overland flow. The rushes don't do what Rebecca was asking, do they dry the ground. It'd be better with trees or something like that would dry the ground and create a better infiltration. Rachel might be able to qualify on that one for us, but I'd say that's the way I'd look at it.
Yeah, that I was going to come in and say something similar. In those areas that are along rivers, the riparian zones, probably rush wouldn't be the ideal thing to put in to try and dry the areas out. It would be better plant it with trees and let go over to scrub, maybe, or planted with, you know, native trees. But I suppose there is a point where maybe those areas of rushes up valleys, through storing water, can maintain base flow in the river during very dry periods. So there's two sides to it. There's, you know, having those swampy, wet areas might allow some water to leak back into the river when it's very dry and maintain flow and keep the ecology going. So I don't think there's a simple solution for anywhere. I think, you know, you need to take it on a river by river, reach by reach basis and see what might work best. But yeah, I don't know.
Well, that's really useful insights, and I think it demonstrates the complexity of the environment that we all live in and the interactions between water and the plants and the land and so on. I want to tackle just a few more of the questions here that have come in to the Q&A. Really good question here now. We're talking about boom spraying MCPA, and then we keep talking about weed wiping glyphosate. Why can you not put MCPA in a weed wiper?
Well, Terence answered it in the video. It's not licensed.
Yeah, so that's basically it's illegal to put illegal, yes, MCPA in a weed wiper. Yeah, so that hopefully answers that question. So you can boom spray MCPA, but it is not licensed for use in a weed wiper. You have to use a glyphosate-based product. And there are a number of product names for those glyphosate-based products that you would find in your local agri store. Okay. Now, this is a question here I've never heard posed before, so I'm interested to hear opinions on this. In terms of cutting rushes and baling them, taking them away. So what about the practice of baling rushes and disposing of the rush bales to reduce seeds? Is that a good technique?
Well, it used to be, Mark, many years ago, rushes would have been cut with a cutting bar and then baled and would have been used for bedding, say for livestock. I think it's probably still used to a small extent. I suppose there's very, very little of that goes on now because number one, quite often you can't get onto these areas because they're too wet to cut with the modern tractors. And secondly, the problem with building up rushes. Say, we're talking now about very dense stands of impenetrable rush. So those rushes would have a lot of seeds, a lot of big seed heads on them. Those seeds would then be, say they're baled up, and they'd then be returned maybe in the farmyard manure or whatever, or slurry to the, well, it'd be farmyard manure if you're bedding with rushes. And those seeds then would be returned maybe to swards that don't have any rush on them. So you're actually transporting, you're actually acting as a vector for rush seeds and pass them on. So it's not something that's widely practiced as far as I know, as baling rush. I think there are obviously some of it goes on, but much less now than used to be the case.
Okay.
So
Okay.
does anybody else want to add anything to that?
I've just heard it mentioned. We used to burn rushes years ago on the farm, but I have been speaking to colleagues in renewable energy, and they've been wondering out loud whether baled rushes couldn't be used as a biofuel.
Interesting.
as going off on a tangent.
Yeah, well, there's potentially an awful lot of fuel out there if that's the case. But
I suppose just to add on to that, Mark, ideally it'd be the Rolls-Royce job is to take the rush off it, and like Terence said, you're dealing with a different terrain. It's not that easy, but the mulching was brought in to succeed that, and it seems to be the best way going forward.
So the mulching then, that's a mechanical control of rushes, isn't it? So the mulching itself, it will break up the stems and the seeds enough that they wouldn't be viable when they get onto.
It'll not do anything with the seeds.
Okay. Oh, right. Okay.
It'll break up the rush, but
yes.
it won't leave a dense mat on the grassland that won't interfere with the grass growth. But it's important, and terms qualify on that. Research from Hillsborough has shown that if you follow it on after mulching with the glyphosate, you have a much improved control of rushes.
Okay, so it's that combination, as you said earlier on, it's the combination of management techniques at the right time of the year. So cutting and mulching, and then when you get the fresh rush growth come up, weed lick it before it goes to seed. So you're controlling the old rush, you're controlling the new rush that's coming up, and over a number of years, you'll deplete the seed bank in the field sufficiently that you'll get your rushes under control. Okay, exactly. So we heard mention in the film about soil fertility and about liming of fields, and we have a question here that lime is useful in tackling rushes. This person says that they found it useful. Now I'm going to read the question as it's written because I don't fully understand the technicalities. Is granular lime as effective compared to calc lime? So is granular lime as effective when compared to calc lime? I
assume the calc lime is the ground limestone.
Right. Okay.
They're two different products. To be straight, I couldn't give you a definitive answer on it, but what I from my previous experience with the granulated lime, if you're using grassland, the idea of the lime is to encourage, you're creating a more favourable environment, as Terence had mentioned in the video. The rushes like an acidic environment and grow. We're creating a more basic environment for grass to grow. Grass grows between 6.3 pH. You're trying to hit that, and if you're using the granulated lime, you would have to come every year applying the granulated lime, whereas with the ordinary ground limestone, all you'd have to we'd be talking about once every 4 years based on the soil test.
Yes.
If anyone else can follow in on that, please do.
No, I think you've given a good answer there, and there's probably more information that can be found online about that. And I noticed that Lorraine has put up a link to a document in the chat function. If anybody wants to copy and paste that out, it's a DAFM document from 2020 that talks about different suppression techniques and control techniques for rushes. So that might be a very useful reference document for people to have a look at. And on that note, I would like just to give the last word to our two representatives from the water companies. So we've got Lorraine Gaston from Irish Water, Diane Foster from Northern Ireland Water. And I might pose the question to you because we've no more in the Q&A box here. So, you know, farmers have to control rushes and they're trying to make a living on their farms, and they need to make sure the land is as productive as possible. So many things that farmers have to think about these days in order to make a living and protect the environment. Is there maybe one thing you would say to farmers, you know, from a water company point of view, in terms of, you know, that partnership working and the benefits of maybe taking a catchment approach, working with landowners, than always having to rely on an end of the pipe solution that we've heard is really expensive? So maybe just open that up for you to make a few comments just at the end, if that's okay.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I suppose it's important to think that you know, the majority of our water comes from surface water that we're taking out of rivers and lakes to treat for drinking water purposes. So, you know, and there's so many of us are living in a drinking water catchment. You know, that river that's nearby you, you know, you mightn't realize it, but maybe a good bit further, maybe 30 kilometers or 15 kilometers or whatever downstream, you know, there's water being taken out there and being treated for supply. So it's just thinking, and that's not just the farmers, as Becca said earlier on, it's everybody, it's all of us, it's me, it's everybody on the panel, it's everybody watching. We all need to think about what we pour down the drain and what's washed into our waterways, because and even if you're not in a drinking water catchment, it's going to affect the river or the lakes. And we want to do our best as individuals, as citizens, to protect the water environment, protect the wildlife, the fish that live there, the otters, whatever it is. So just think, I suppose, before you pour something onto the land, about how it's going to get washed off, and just always adhere to the best practice. And I guess I just finish by thanking all those farmers in the Derg catchment who have participated in our land incentive scheme and who really partnered up with us on the project and done their bit to change practices and to reduce MCPA by switching to weed wiping. We are so grateful to you. You know, it is fantastic. It really just, you can see the results there. It's starting to make a difference, and we're just so grateful and hope that that continues from here on in. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Diane. That's brilliant. And Lorraine, from Irish Water's point of view, those small changes that farmers can make, like switching from boom spraying to weed wiping, doesn't just benefit the farm business, it benefits the water environment. And from Irish Water's point of view, what kind of benefit will you see from that partnership approach through the Source to Tap project?
Well, it's hard to kind of follow on from Diane. She kind of covered a lot there, but I'd say for us, we are in a situation where we have quite a number of drinking water supplies. We've got over 1,000 catchments that cover the whole of the Republic of Ireland, and when you add it up by area, that's 50% of the country. So pretty much wherever you are, you need to be mindful that there may be a drinking water supply nearby. And it's just taking care, and I think being aware that MCPA is probably more persistent than people realise, that it really doesn't take a lot to cause a problem downstream. And it's just to take care if you have to use it, and look for alternatives would be the preference as well. And I think the project Source to Tap is great in demonstrating that can actually work. And so yeah, thanks to everyone for their hard work on the project.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Lorraine. So it just remains for me to thank everyone for attending the webinar this evening. I hope you found it interesting and useful. Certainly, the project has been a joy for us to deliver over the last number of years. We've learned a lot from it, but we're learning together with the landowners that we are working with. So I just want to thank everyone, as Diane and Lorraine have, for taking part in the project or supporting the project over the years. I just want to say thank you also to our panelists this evening, to Diane and Lorraine, to Terence and Donal, Rebecca and Rachel. And there's also someone else that's been involved in the event this evening who's remained hidden away in the background, Caitlin Kennedy, who's kept the whole show on the road. So a big thank you to her as well. So thank you very much and good evening.